All right, good morning, good morning. It is almost the afternoon, but I will say good morning for as long as I can. First of all, welcome to the session on building a national coaching strategy. I am neither Vince nor Kristen. My name is Kevin Connors. I'm from the Susan Cron Exchange. We are a grant-making foundation that is preparing young people to thrive in a rapidly changing world. Practically what that means is we support the folks on the ground who are doing that incredible work. That includes Project Play. That includes many youth sports organizations across the country as well. One quick thing before we dig in, my job is just to set the stage for Vince and Kristen, who will be facilitating this discussion. We are incredibly energized by the positive energy in this room and how many of you came to join us for this discussion. But I will quickly just make one housekeeping note about these microphones. These are not really on. You won't hear my voice being amplified. They are for the recording, so don't wonder why you won't actually hear. We are aware. We had a big discussion about it earlier with IT. So as I said, our job at Susan Cron Exchange is really to support really innovative and impactful work. And that led us to the world of youth sports about 6 years ago when I came into the foundation. And 3 years ago, we launched an initiative called the Million Coaches Challenge. It is a national coalition of 15 organizations who are collectively training 1 million coaches in youth development and drawing attention to the true power of a coach. Many of our partners are in this room today. It's incredible to see you. And as part of that initiative, we've really come to a few conclusions, but one is a motivating factor for us for doing the work, and it's that the research is clear, right? Sports matter, coaches matter. Sports are uniquely suited to help young people heal from trauma and stress, to build community with peers and adults, to help them develop the social emotional skills that are most correlated to long-term life outcomes. We all know that in this room, but the other piece that really drives our work at Susan Cron Exchange is just our personal experiences, that coaches matter. For me, I learned that lesson a long time ago. Growing up, my childhood was spent on the playing field. I'm sure like many of you in this room. I played competitive sports 365 days a year. They were my passion, but by the time I reached high school, I was just burned out. And I was so burned out that when the first day of baseball tryouts came around, I was nowhere to be seen. In fact, I decided that I just no longer wanted to play baseball, which was my best sport. But of course, I did not tell anyone about that decision. I just didn't show up on the first day. Later that night, the phone rang in our house. And of course, it was like the old school phone, like the one in the kitchen with the long cord. Like everyone could hear it ring, and then we could all watch my mom as she talked to the person on the other line. And it was my coach, or my future coach. He asked first how I was. Then he asked where I was. And he encouraged my mom to have me come out the next day and give baseball a try for that season. Now, I was 14, so I was incredibly embarrassed. I was very ashamed. It was a hard situation to navigate, but my coach opened this door, welcomed me back, and helped a 14-year-old kid kind of work through a bunch of complex and intense emotions. 10 years later, I too became a high school baseball coach. The work that brings us here today is built on stories like those. For me, I've full of stories like those, and I know everyone in this room is as well, and that's part of our goal. Vince and Kristen are going to invite you to share your insights, your stories, your ideas of how collectively we can build a system where every child has access to a great coach. A national coaching strategy can only stand if it authentically honors the individual and collective wisdom in this room. The experts are here, the doers are here, we all represent different corners of the universe. And so the ask is that today you just bring your full self, what you know from your professional life, what you experienced in your personal life, your kids' lives. Bring all of that to this discussion so that we can help support a national strategy and system that really moves the ball forward and creates a system where coaches are supported, respected, and there to support everyone, everywhere. So I'm going to hand it off to Kristen and to Vince. They're going to facilitate a discussion. It is an interactive session, so just be ready. I'm a former teacher. I will not be calling on folks. I actually get to sit down and not say anything now, which is a wonderful place to be. But it is Vince and Kristen's job to take it from here. So thank you all for being here, and off to you.
Yeah, slightly weird talking to a mic that doesn't great sound. But if anyone wants to sort of move over to that side of the room, now would probably be the time. But if not, I'm overwhelmed in some respect by the interest and the excitement around coaching, and also just like enthused. It's going to be awesome. So I'm going to give I'm going to say a few things before we sort of really get into it. One is we are definitely going to go probably 10 minutes into lunch. So if you needs to get out of here right at 12:30, totally understand. You're welcome to just get up and go. But we are going to go probably 12:40, maybe 12:45. I just know how conversations go when people get excited. It just means you have 45 minutes for lunch. Okay, hopefully that's enough time. I'm Vince Minjares. I am the program manager for the Aspen Institute Sport and Society program. I lead our coaching and school sport portfolios, spend a lot of time in the Million Coaches Challenge piece. I am not going to belabor my background, but I am going to introduce Kristen Dieffenbach, who is with the U.S. Center for Coaching Excellence and the University of West Virginia. You can read our bios sort of later. There's a lot to get through, so we're going to kind of just jump into it if that's okay. This is an interactive session, and so Slido will be used regularly. You can pull up the QR code there or on these handy-dandy little table tents, which also go directly to the session. We invite you, these are entirely optional, they are not required, but we would love for you to answer the questions. So we would ask you to answer this first question right now so that everyone understands who's in this room. Share a little bit about your role and background. Again, not required, you don't even have to share your name, you can be anonymous. Would be good to know sort of where everyone is at. Kristen, any other comments as people are talking to you guys?
Well, just a reminder that those of you who are kind of crammed in on that side, please feel free to come over here. We have a whole wall, no more chairs, I'm sorry, but we have a whole wall free for you if you'd like to move over here.
I'll also say that Kristen is going to be leading, Kristen is a university professor, so she actually will be facilitating the conversation with Slido. So do you want to say anything about Slido and how we'll be operating?
Yeah, so with Slido, once you've opened it, just leave it open the whole time. Every time we sort of move past a slide, your Slido on your phone or your tablet will kind of go blank. And then when we get to another Slido in the presentation, it'll open up a new one. So you don't need to close the window. You don't need to scan that QR code again. It'll just sort of move through that as we go through. The other kind of nice thing is that while things pop up here, and they're going to go through pretty quickly, you should be able to scroll back through them on your own phone to get a sense of who's in the room and who's part of this conversation. And as we get to some of the other ones, you'll see those responses.
Okay, we'll give it maybe like 30 more seconds.
Some of you type really fast.
Yeah, that's really fast. I will say, diversity and inclusiveness is an important part.
Okay, hopscotch enthusiast, I just need to know who you are. That's brilliant.
Diversity of perspective is really important in this conversation. A national coaching strategy, or the idea or the concept of a national strategy, has to have as many voices as possible, right? And I will give you the sort of obviously first bit is we don't have a strategy, nor are we coming to this session with a planned strategy. We are going to pull from all of you starting today and moving throughout the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, however long it takes, to actually capture as many insights, voices, questions, ideas to help this country build a vision and a process and a strategy for coaching. We don't know a lot, but we can get started talking about it. And I think that's what this session is about. I am going to move forward with this, so if you haven't entered, apologies. How many of you have read recommendation 11 of the commission report? Raise your hand. Okay. I'm not going to belabor the commission report, but for those of you who don't know, we've had this major initiative to examine the Olympic movement in this country. Among many recommendations in the report that was released, recommendation 11 specifically targets coaching, and it calls for really improvement in coaching at all levels, but specifically itemizes a couple quite interesting things, right? ADM, the American Development Model, should be adopted universally. Colleges should offer degree programs and certificates in coaching. There's a lot of tax kind of references, interestingly, which we'll talk about today, the role of tax law potentially in helping us support the development of coaches. And, you know, obviously the need for training and educational opportunities for volunteer parents.
And I will say, you know, recommendation 11 is my favorite out of the 12. It's where I spend most of my time. But it is full of a lot of good things. If you haven't looked at the report, it's worth a download and a read. And just a couple of notes about it, that if you're not familiar with ADM yet, or it's not something part of your conversation, long-term athletic development has been part of the conversation for the last 15 or so years, and so really building on that. The other thing that I think is interesting in the report is the encouragement for public universities to offer degrees, and I would slip the word more in there. The last study we did in 2019, we have about 65 programs around the country at the university level that offer some sort of undergraduate degree, master's degree, or certificate. Those are the ones that are specifically called coaching education, but there are many more out there that don't necessarily title themselves that way that are working in this area, in this field, and we're working on a post-COVID version since the universities have shifted. But there's a lot here that we'll try to unpack and keep part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's a timely conversation. Obviously, today, you know, this one, begin a national dialogue. That's what we're doing today. So the recommendation of the report is that we should have a national dialogue on coaching. That's what this session is about. That's why we're doing this session, right? No better place than the summit. I will say, though, that this conversation also comes at an interesting time. I think sort of like everything on the left, I would describe as the era of reform, right? I'm not even putting the pandemic up here, but if you think about safe sport, you think about college sports reform, you think about, obviously, the commission report, we are in an era of reform, so it's a quite timely moment.
And I think this is that piece that we want to recognize. There is already a ton of wonderful things that are being done, and this conversation is already going. That's why this makes this such an exciting time to start bringing this together. And when we start looking at the fact that we have a lot of literature on positive youth development or sport-based youth development programs, we have a lot of literature on what we see when we put coaches out into spaces, and we have a lot of literature around the coach-athlete relationship and some of these different areas, athlete-centered coaching. And there are certainly a lot of places to continue to grow that. But one of the things we talk about this constantly, how do we start connecting the dots between all the people who are so passionate and doing great work in so many different sectors to bring them together into this really important collective conversation?
It's interesting, the international movement on coaching is alive and well. Mm-hmm. I moved to New Zealand. I lived in New Zealand for 8 years to pursue a PhD in coaching, and I lived in New Zealand as a coach developer and worked in their national coaching system. There are other countries doing amazing work from a national perspective, right? And I think we, as a country, we know, the thing I will say is that there's been amazing work happening in coaching in the United States. Many of you in this room are part of I think its own movement. How can we continue to level up that to a national dialogue that recognizes the work that's been happening in this country and abroad to develop the systems we need? So, this is the guiding question of this project. We'll see how much we find out today. If we had a national coaching strategy for youth sports, what would go in it? That is our guiding question. In terms of a few parameters for this conversation, number one, we are focusing primarily on the concept of youth sports coaches, which we are defining as coaches who are engaged with youth in sport and physical activity settings, ages 6 to 18. Okay, so we are not really talking about college coaches or professional coaches, but they will come up because it's a connected ecosystem. So there will be some places where we need to talk about these things in concert, but for the purpose of this conversation, youth sports coaches means age. We are not defining the context as yet, and that's a part of the conversation we'll have. The other thing we're not doing is we're not defining an implementer of a strategy. So we're not actually saying who's going to implement whatever supposed strategy comes up. We don't know. The commission report recommended an Office of Sport. We don't have that yet. We hope to have something like that. Who knows if it's going to happen? That requires Congress to act. That requires our government to act. We don't know if that's going to be a thing that happens. A couple assumptions. One, everything is connected. So even though we've broken this session out into sort of 5 bucket areas, all of them overlap. And there will be things in one that apply to another. So don't think of them as standalone by themselves. They can be solved in their own way. Coaches are people. Kristen has been very intentional about context and language, particularly the language around how we talk about coaches, not as a thing, but as people who coach. And I think that's an important nuance that we've tried to capture as much as possible. Context is really, really important here. Coaches are not a monolith. They're not one group. There are many different contexts for coaching that we have to be mindful of as we go through. So even though we might want to really say, well, this doesn't matter for volunteer parent coaches, or this doesn't matter for high school coaches, we have to have a system that works for everybody. Obviously, we're thinking about this through the lens of, can our coaching system better support quality and access, right? How are we thinking about coaches and the people who coach as folks who are facilitating, supporting quality experiences and more opportunities for sport? Our ask of you today is share your experiences, help us refine the questions, the issues. We won't get it right. This is a first pass. So there'll be things like Vince, Kristen, I would change this, I would ask this, I would suggest this. Amplify the dialogue and set your expectations for a 1-hour session. This is breadth, not depth, okay? We're not gonna go as deep as you want or as we want. Okay?
We've been talking about that because for the last 2 months as we've been preparing and talking about this, every time we talk, it probably takes about 6 times as long as anything for any of these conversations.
Yeah.
And I would just reiterate, the coaches are people, so thinking about that and stepping away from all the stereotypes. We have a lot of stereotypes around the word coach, and as soon as you put a capital C in the front of the word coach, it becomes someone's name, and it takes on an even bigger meaning. So step back and think about the people who are fulfilling the roles of coaching as we come through this, because that really helps us expand that conversation to what that job should do and how do we help support people in doing that job and preparing for that job and all of those things.
Okay. I want to acknowledge Sam and Dawn. I don't know if Sam and Dawn are here, but the National Coach Survey is a critical part of this conversation. We were relying on it heavily. Life Sports team at Ohio State did the lion's share of work here in terms of the analysis. Obviously, want to thank Nike and Susan Crown Exchange for supporting the initiative, getting this off the ground. This is critical. We'll talk about data and research as we go, but the National Coach Survey is a fundamental information source for us to do this work, and we need more things like this. Here are the 5 bucket areas that will guide our conversation. They are recruitment, support, education and training, governance, and data and research. The first one is recruitment. And the way that we'll structure this is a guiding question for each section. So this question is an important one that I think many folks appreciate. Do we have the supply of coaches to meet demand and the diversity of backgrounds to meet youth needs? A couple pieces to get us started. One, National Coach Survey, 10,000 coaches across the country, wide range of respondents, 80% agreed our community needs more coaches. So I think we can probably all appreciate that shortage of coaches is an issue, much like officials, much like volunteers in general. I personally flagged the teacher coach piece. A number of states are in a real shortage around teachers coaching, losing teachers to coach. I know Florida, Maine, New Jersey, Texas, for different reasons, but a lot of them connected to questions of burnout, to questions of workload, but also to questions of stresses and pressures in the role, right? I see a lot of head nods. Shortages are one side of the coin. The other side is the diversity question. And the survey did some really interesting work in asking coaches about their preparation to work with special populations. Some of that work specifically highlighted, well, if we're being honest, the lack of preparation, that many coaches don't feel prepared to work with unique populations who are different from them. These are just a few examples. And this is effectively coaches saying, we're seeing a third, maybe a little bit more than a third of coaches saying that they're prepared, they're moderately or extremely prepared to work with someone who's a refugee or an immigrant, someone who identifies as LGBTQIA+. I mean, I think you get the idea. There's also just the general problem of volunteerism. And I'm going to throw a thought starter before we ask our first question of you. Anybody look at the AmeriCorps data on volunteerism? It's really interesting because what we're finding from a volunteerism perspective is that there's a decline in formal volunteering, okay? So right now it's 23% of the country, which is roughly 60 million people. This is a 7 percentage point decline during the pandemic. Like, oh yeah, pandemic happened, people stopped volunteering, sure. Women declined more than men, although women still volunteer at higher rates. But parents were still fairly high, and Gen X was high, which means we have some age and context issues in volunteerism, right? So it makes sense that parents are more likely to volunteer. This is not sports specific, by the way, this is just general people. What I found fascinating about this was that data also includes informal helping. So this is assisting others outside of an organizational context, such as doing favors for neighbors. That data, 51% of people are doing that, and that stayed stable through the same period. So people are still helping their neighbors. People are still giving of their time. Veterans, 60%. Non-parents, who are very low, obviously in this space, 50%. It raises an interesting question about the perception of the ask of coaching. If we were to sort of transition this into our thinking about why people turn down coaching, are people, are in this bucket, could we get them to think about it in this bucket? Or is that, I don't know. I don't know if you want to say anything about that. So, first question to you, and I know there's a couple things here.
So as we move into this, back to Slido, go ahead and open, you should be able to just open up whatever browser you had open that was in this. If you need to, you can take the QR code again, or if you've just joined us, please take a scan of the QR code. And it'll lead you to this question. What would you prioritize to grow the size and the diversity of the coaching pool that we have? Thinking about who's out there. And we did put a couple of things up there. What of those things we put up there would you prioritize? This is where I get to see who's slacking, because so far only 4 of you have answered the question. And there's more than 4 of you here.
As you answer, feel free to just chat with your neighbor. Like, what did you answer and why? Yeah. You got to pick one.
You feel free to introduce yourself and have a chat with your neighbor. What did you prioritize and why? We're not in the camera. All right, now I get to practice my teacher voice and see if I can pull you guys back a little bit. Always the risk, right? When you let a group of coaches and people who are passionate about something free to pull you back. So I appreciate you guys coming back as we get going here. So we have 114 people that have weighed in here. And as we take a look at this, right, we have interesting breakdown of the way that the room is sort of responding to what you prioritize. I'm wondering if, and we do have a couple of mics, so we do need, for when you guys speak up, that we run a mic to you. But would be really interested to hear from somebody that maybe selected that increasing on the ground support and sort of what you were thinking about that, if someone would like to share. Here, give you my mic.
So I went with increasing on support for resources for coaches. I think there's a lot of people that played sports growing up and don't understand how to they played at a very high level like college or even like varsity level in high school, and they don't know how to tone it down to like teach a youth the simplicity of like what sports are. And I think it can be very overwhelming when you get on the field and you start coaching high knees and you start going through these hard, intense drills and the kids aren't picking up on it. And it's because they don't understand even like how to play a sport to begin with, or like what the structure even is like. So I think overall, just like getting more resources for people that really love the sport and being able to like help out the youth in general that are just starting their sports career is something that's very important and needs to be more simpler in a way.
But you think that's a thing that will draw more people into coaching?
Yes, I do. I do really think that that would really help out, because now they're not feeling as overwhelmed when they get on the field for the first time. If a college athlete wants to help out at a youth level, they have the structured base of like how to help out in that way.
I very much appreciate that. And you're sitting next to Karen, who I know is coming from a PE background, that's going, yes, 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 yes. And anybody who's ever tried to watch a 10 or 11, 12-year-old do a foot ladder, if the last time you saw a foot ladder done was with a 20-year-old, you're just like, oh, no hope. Like the last time I watched a bunch of kids do foot ladder, it was double foot. It was just bad. It was so bad, right? So I'd love to hear from somebody else that chose something else on the list. What would you want to share?
Yeah, so I chose changing perceptions of who would make a good coach. I think that we've lowered the bar to, if you can pass a background check and you're a good role model for my kid, you could be a coach. And it's like, yeah, no. And so I think we focus more on just finding good people, right? Like I have parents that say, man, that's a good man, but he doesn't know anything about basketball, right? And so you don't want to judge the coach because he is a good man and he does love kids, but he doesn't know how to coach a sport and elevate a kid. So now you get into the season and now you're judging him in a way that you probably shouldn't. And now you're losing a good person. And it's just, yeah, so we need to just raise the quality of coach.
Very much resonate with that. And I think I heard some beginning claps when that first jumped in. Well, and I know we've got 5 of these to go through. So I want to ask one more question about this, and we'll sort of poll. Did anybody want something that they wanted to select and prioritize that's not on this list?
So we talked a little bit about creating a pipeline. And we also, one of the things that I thought of was, you're not going to ask a babysitter to be with your kid for 25 hours a week, or a teacher to work with your child for however many hours a week without paying them. And so in a lot of settings that we work in, we always say you got to create a job out of it. And then that kind of creates a loop for a young person to be trained as a coach, to get a job as a coach, and to continue to coach and bring in some income for themselves. So that's something I was thinking about.
Very much appreciate that. And I know we've got a lot of hands, but Vincent's going to have to let me do that.
I got to be the bad guy here because we have 5 of these to get through, and this is why I said we're going to go wide, not deep, okay? So just be prepared for only maybe 2 or 3 responses as we go. Continue the conversations, though, outside of this.
But what I would encourage you to do is jot those thoughts down, and at the very end, we'll provide our contact. We want to hear from you. We want to know what you're thinking. Yeah. We're trying to start the conversation. So please jot your thoughts down and share them with us at the end.
But this data is really interesting because I will say this. Your responses here probably are more important for us because they will inform future versions of this conversation. They will become obviously, it's anonymous data that we can share with people and share with entities and organizations. Hey, we had a diverse group of folks who attended Project Play Summit who prioritized this in recruitment. Okay, next one, support. Ironically, nice segue because on-the-ground support was listed. Let's actually dive deeper into the support question because this is operating from the perspective we have active coaches now who need support, not just recruiting more coaches to come in. And this does speak to the retention question. It also speaks to the well-being question. Coaching can be really stressful for a variety of reasons, some of which I have highlighted here. Again, National Coach Survey data, 69% of coaches report that coaching is moderately, very, or extremely stressful. Interestingly, the things I've itemized on the right were not a stress-related question. They were a resource need question. So they asked coaches to identify the resources that they felt they needed And you see an interesting diversity, but very high volume. So again, as the comment was just made, yeah, payment to coach. Duh. Be nice to make a bit of money doing this. I think we all appreciate the issue. But I think we know how controversial and how challenging pay is from a coaching perspective. I think the question is, okay, let's say that pay is off the table for me as an organization. Are there other things that I can think about? And one of the things to think about that I think this data is particularly interesting around is coaches taking on organizational burdens, right? Taking on burdens that maybe are the responsibility of the organization they're working with. So something like equipment or uniforms. Coaches saying, I'll have those things for my team, right? Or something like transportation, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Obviously, support. And I would sort of look at something like administrative support as a bit of a proxy for parents, working with parents, right? We know that parents are a source of stress, in some contexts more than others. And so I think you have an interesting diversity of ways that organizations can support coaches on the ground, okay?
And I think one of the things that's really interesting here that we talked about quite a bit when you look at that needs and when you look at some of the other research out there, there are sort of the two categories that coaches are really, what do my kids need? How do I better support my kids? What are the resources my kids need? And we are just starting to take a look at the coach well-being and the coach burnout side of things and what do they need in that individual role. And so there's two really important pieces to that conversation as we think about what's really making that environment very stressful for them and how might we start to think about the support that's needed.
And it's an interesting thing to try to think about systematizing something like support from a peer and administration perspective, because like how much are you going to policy culture? Like that's really hard to do. You can't really policy culture. Particularly if a welcoming environment or having collegiality or having social opportunities with my peers is something that actually improves my well-being as a coach. But a national conversation can address that. I think the interesting piece is thinking about, are there some of these things structurally from an institutional-wide perspective and maybe a government perspective that could act on it? I'll give you an interesting example. Anybody heard of the Volunteer Driver Tax Appreciation Act? Okay, so the idea is, okay, look, if we think about the transportation question, it's hard to say whether or not the transportation question is getting my kids to games or getting myself to games. And if you ask yourself, if we think about this as, I can't coach because gas is expensive, and getting to a tournament on the weekends is hard for me as a part-time or volunteer or whatever coach. And it's interesting because did you know that there is a volunteer mileage tax credit? So if you are a volunteer in this country, you can get a tax deduction on gas, but it's only 14 cents a mile. It's not very much. The business tax deduction is 66 cents a mile. So this specific legislation was aimed at equalizing those two rates, saying, hey, why are volunteers getting a lower tax deduction than people who own businesses? If we want to encourage more volunteerism in this country, what if we use tax law to incentivize and give some kind of credit? And this is where I think taxes are really fascinating. Like, never thought I would be thinking about tax law, ever, right? So that's a kind of a thought starter in thinking about something like, can we get creative with financial relief that maybe isn't pay in the short term while we work on the pay issue long term, right?
So moving into our next Slido. So again, it should just pop up if you've already had Slido open. And we're going to do again, this is the popcorn super fast approach to trying to get a little interaction here. But thinking about the resources that you'd prioritize off of the list that we've sort of created here. What might you prioritize to better support individuals who coach?
Sorry, can I just, coach training is going to come up somewhere else?
Oh, yes.
Okay, because
Don't worry.
this is just supports other than coach training.
There's an entire section called education.
Yes. Don't worry, Megan. Don't worry. Got your back. I got you. Don't worry. You know that's my main thing. We got that.
Just wondering.
Yeah. So, and you feel free to have a chat with your neighbor for just a second. I'll stop you, but go ahead and have a chat. Have a chat. So, do we have to break out the clap once, clap twice? No. You know, it's in my other coat. All right. So, I'm completely remiss in that my coaching whistle is in my other vest, but we'll go ahead and pull you guys back in. And I'm really curious. And Megan brought up training, which we're going to come back to because it's an essential piece. But what other supports were not on this list that you were thinking about and really would have liked to have seen on this list? Hold on. Over here first.
I think one of the biggest things that's missing is a little education on parents on how to support a coach, because I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges coaches face and drop out of, because the parents don't totally understand how to support the coach. And I would love to see something like that on there.
Awesome. Very much appreciate that. I know I saw another hand over here.
I would say stable access to facilities. There's a lot of teams, specifically club teams, that don't have a home gym and don't always know if they're going to practice, when they're going to practice, where they're going to practice.
I appreciate it. Going back into that bucket of when they're worried about their kids and where their kids are going to be, it becomes so important.
I want to tie this one back to the first question about changing perceptions. I just think it's important to note that only 25% of youth sports coaches are women. And so what we hear a lot from women and people of color trying to make their way in coaching is that the spaces, like working against those dominant cultures, is the most stressful thing that they face. So support to like work in a culture that wasn't built for them, and maybe that's in training, but like I think that's something that creates a lot of burnout for women and people of color is working in systems that don't feel welcoming and inclusive to them.
I mean, the fact that the only locker room that was available for me as the only female coach at the rink was the bathroom. Right.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because obviously administrative support is a very large, like big term, but I think in that space, flexibility in working with folks who have lots of things going on outside of coaching, and I think particularly we've seen some of that work around. I need an athletic director or I need a sport program director who's willing to work with me in my scheduling to make this work for me, right?
Well, and I think what that starts to speak to that gets really important, and again, as Vince and I, at the assumptions at the beginning, right, how much overlap, it starts to speak to the fact that with a lot of these resources and things, they're things that are beyond what the coach themselves can do. They're beyond the things that even the person that's the coach director or organizing the coaches can do, and it starts to speak to what does our administrative administrative roles, what do they know about this space, and how much do they really understand, and then how do we educate that out in the circle, in that ecosystem that we've been talking about, to start thinking about how everybody plays a role, and it won't really move forward until there's enough collective action happening across those different layers. So again, a really, really quick surface, take a look at this and start to think about it, but that's sort of our goal today.
And again, as a reminder, there will be sections that there's overlap across these sessions. There's an entire section that could fit in another one. There's an entire piece that connects to another one. These are all interconnected. Education and training, which is obviously its own really, really important part of our ecosystem, and obviously been, a focus of certainly Project Play. Many of our partners, many of you all are, I'm sure, are educators yourselves working on different facets of education and training. And so again, from a broad perspective, the question is, can our education and training systems meet the learning needs for people who coach? It's an interesting question that obviously we know many of us are spending years trying to figure these questions out. A couple things we'll throw out here. Okay, and actually we're going to start the question.
I was going to say, we started, because with that last one, we really had a long chat about that question we were going to even put up, because the needs of the coaches, but ultimately it's the needs of the people they are coaching that they need to be prepared to meet. And so we wanted to start off with a question for you with just a quick finish the sentence. From what I know, most coaches would benefit from training in this topic. What is that topic? So we'll see what's coming out of the group. And I think what always starts to really resonate with me when we start making these lists is the tremendous level of expectation and importance of areas that we start to talk about for someone that's going to be prepared often with a module or just one single touch. And how important it is to start thinking about how do we even prioritize some of these lists when we're saying that these children and their experiences are the paramount. And that starts to turn some of these conversations and some of these pieces on their head, right? That is that module, is that piece of paper, is that half hour enough? Seeing a lot here around the safety of children, the safety of the spaces. We see a lot of the interpersonal skills, right? The skills to relate to other people, to communicate, to build relationships. We know that coaching is a tremendous relationship experience. The beginning. I'm not seeing a whole lot about techniques and tactics. I'm not seeing anything about rules, right? I'm not seeing anything about those things. And that's when we really start talking about. We also sometimes have seen really a lot about those relationships and about the spaces and the safety.
I'm interested. No, I'm not going to say. I talked too much.
No, you're fine.
Okay. Maybe 30 more seconds. There's two sides to the coin.
Reading them.
That we're starting the conversation about education and training. The first is the question of. The first is the question of coaching and what kind of learning we're after from a. You could use the word competencies. You could use the word learning outcomes. You could use the word skills. What kind of skills do coaches need, right? And I think, this gets into curriculum design, and this starts getting into design of certificates, and what should the certificate include, and what should all the things that we need to cover? And I think it's a really, obviously, critical question to ask, okay? I do think I'm gonna move on from this, so if you haven't, we have two people left.
Vince just hit the one that I get most excited about, right? Where's the education in the coaching education?
Right.
The concept of the pedagogy for the children, what do we need to know about education to teach a child? And then what do we need to know about education to prepare individuals who are going to work in that space? So where's the education in our coaching education?
The thing I will say is that so the ICCE, which is an entity that does a lot of international work in this space, has something called bachelor's degree standards, where they actually, if you have a bachelor's degree in coaching, here's what it should include. And that's a really long list.
It's a document that we put together that's about 30 pages long and has a ton of, and we recognize fully when we put together that information that not everybody and not every program can absolutely have everything that's in there, but we do know that all of important elements that should go into coaching education from a.
One of the biggest challenges we have in our coaching ecosystem is figuring out it's not just about listing what coaches need to learn. It's building a system that allows people to access all the things that we know are super important in timely ways that work for them, right, but also get them to the competencies and the skills that help kids. And that's really hard to do in a fragmented ecosystem where we're all moving in opposite directions.
And it's incredibly important to note that the ICCE document, which is the International Council on Coaching Excellence, and the group that I'm with, the USCCE, is the United States sort of similar connected piece. There is no recommendation that people should have a bachelor's degree to be a coach. Not at this stage, not at this conversation. Brazil is the only country that currently has that standard in their system, except for a few exceptions like, say, soccer. But for the most part, they've got that set up. But we're not recommending that. We're just saying that the recognition that the sciences of pedagogy, the sciences of sports sciences, and all those areas are advanced enough that we do have that content, information, and knowledge that you could create and prepare a fully loaded bachelor's degree the same way that we prepare teachers in other spaces. Yeah. So it's not the recommendation that you should have to do it that way, but if you were to do it, we have the information. We have the sciences.
Okay. So, again, just for information, right, again, National Coach Survey and SFIA have produced data on training. SFIA gives a sort of generic training in effective motivational techniques among a couple other sort of items. Only 26% of coaches have completed it, according to the survey. Obviously, the thing that we liked about the National Coach Survey was diving a bit deeper, not just in what they've completed, but what they want. And what they want and what they need actually both, I would argue, align with everything that's been said in this room, right? So obviously, the they still very much want coaching tactics and strategies and techniques, but are also increasingly recognizing the importance of a number of other interpersonal, psychosocial, youth development, life skill focused areas. Interestingly, when you ask them to rate their confidence in certain behaviors, you also get an entry into what coaches need, right? Or what would benefit them, right? Social media, linking athletes to mental health resources. You know, this is obviously what Coach Loxley was just talking about on stage, is really sort of coaches recognizing. So it includes recreational, includes high school, includes club, includes a wide spectrum of contexts. Yeah. 6 to 18, it's in that sort of, in the same frame. Yeah, 10,000 coaches. Next question.
Yeah, so we move into our next slide. So go ahead, go and open up your space there for that. And we want another one-word answer. From what I know, the source that has the greatest impact on coach learning, and by today we mean sort of in the modern society, is what? So where do you think coaches are getting or receiving or learning about their space of coaching? What's impacting their ability to what sources are they getting information from?
I didn't write the survey, so I don't know if there's anyone from SFIA here. It's however the coach interprets that.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the question. I was trained in effective motivational techniques. So however they interpret it is how we think about it.
So I think it's really interesting that your experience, right? The fact that it's getting so big in the word cloud means that it's coming out of a majority of folks here. And that becomes a really interesting one because that experience means that whoever you're working with is the person that's guiding and developing you. And if you ever go to any of the big national coaching museums, the one in St. Louis for the National Basketball Coaches Museum and some of those others, you'll see coaching trees that get built, right? I am the product of who I worked with and I get perpetuated down. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we do then have a bit of a challenge of who is that mentor and how is that information being handed down? And some of the literature we currently have around athlete to coach transition, what we call a within sport transition in those spaces, is finding that some of the very positive things get passed forward, but so do some of the very negative or less than helpful or less than safe practices that get passed forward from one generation to the next because of that heavy reliance just on experience, and experience that's often not guided by anything coming from an outside space as we think about coach preparation and this quality that we've sort of that's been underpinning our conversation here.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move us in. I'm going to start kind of working a little bit faster through this. The other side of the coin of what coaches should be trained on or learn is how coaches learn, how people learn to coach. Right? And I think there's an interesting piece around the relationship of formal education and training to what is often called non-formal and unmediated or informal learning. And obviously we're not going to do a lecture here, but how do we sort of establish this relationship where we are valuing maybe the experience piece, the peer piece, and integrating it in some more intentional way with the formal education, the courses, the training. And that is a very big systems question that we have to figure out. There are different models of coach education that are popping up all the time, and maybe we need a more sort of established framework for how these things all ideally work together that's doable and sustainable. I will say that a group like LTA out of tennis in Britain has done something quite interesting where their credentialing formally acknowledges some of the informal learning that many coaches engage in. So things like listening to podcasts, reading a book chapter, attending some peer event. They're actually integrating that into their coach education system. Fascinating approach. They do a number of other really, really interesting things from a coach development perspective. Would need to go start moving really quickly through this. So You got 30 seconds to answer this question. What's one thing you would change about the way coach education happens in our country, which is obviously not a 30-second question, but what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about a change you would make in coach education in this country? Sorry, and that was, yeah.
I think those are really interesting words, the difference between a centralized approach and to mandate something. There's a really deep and interesting conversation to be had about the challenges of when you mandate something and it becomes I have to versus you inspire something and you centralize it and you incentivize it, and what that does to education and learning. Somebody's hungry. We have more snack-sized curriculum. I read that at first and thought it said more snacks. I do have a sport organization I work with that uses beer and gear to get their coaches places.
Nice.
I love the idea of the ongoing and the micro-learning. I think that starts to become really powerful, that idea that this is an ongoing, evolving space and expectation for coaches and in our systems.
Okay. Governance. Again, high level. We can spend a lot of time going through these things. Guiding question here is, what responsibilities do leadership bodies have to people who coach? Obviously, education is one facet of leadership body responsibility. But we can also think about a number of other areas: advocacy, obviously support. And so it's an interesting space. I will very quickly go back to my New Zealand roots, which is, just to give you a context for what we're talking about here, the orange is the high performance, really that means Olympic coaches are the responsibility of high performance sport New Zealand. And the green are 3 communities of coaches, what they call foundational, developmental, and performance coaches. That's the responsibility of the community support team at Sport New Zealand. Now, not saying we adopt their model, it's sort of giving you the concept of responsibility, that there is an organization who has a responsibility to support, educate, train certain groups. These groups and their organizational responsibility should map onto pathways where the coaches are very sort of clearly in some, or at least some digestible way, understood in relation to each other. So there's a clear relationship of not just who's responsible to which organization is responsible to which group of coaches, but how the coaching communities are related to each other, right? And so that sort of gets us to the conversation of a pathway. And is there a pathway in this country where I can move between different coaching spaces, whether easily, and our institutions are working together to do that? Well, I'm asking a lot, I know.
And then those being both between sports and within a sport. So if I'm going from a lower level to a higher level, or from one sport to another.
Now, if you think about our community of subsectors, this is sort of an attempt to capture the range of programs that exist. And I've intentionally used the word plus sport here for the one on the left, which reflects organizations that maybe are not formally attached to sort of, for example, competition. That it's a sport is a part of a youth program.
Like a Girls on the Run or some of those types of programs.
I don't know where Girls on the Run, Allie, you're here. I don't know where you would
here. I'm giving her a shout
identify,
out.
where you would identify in this sort of like facet, but probably there. There's a lot of different groups in our country of coaches. And the question is, who is responsible for them and how do they relate to each other? The fascinating thing for me is thinking about how coaches in this space maybe not necessarily formally connected to coaches in these spaces, but they're informally viewed as inspiration, or viewed as coaching models, or viewed as careers that they aspire to. So there is a informal relationship that already exists, and the question is, could we create a more formal relationship or a more agreed upon structure?
I think there's also just a really important recognition that this is often viewed as somehow this is where you start and you aspire there, and we forget about the depth of each one of these categories and how
Correct.
important it is to be in that lane and the depth that's needed for those spaces.
Right. Within subgroup pathways, right? So not going from a high school coach to a college coach, but going from an entry high school coach to an experienced or expert high school coach, right? Okay. Question.
So we're moving. He's going to give me time for this question. So real quick, you guys can open up your Slido. And thinking about the responsibilities, responsibilities should the coaching associations have to the people coaching youth sport? So stay with youth sport.
Sorry, and just one thing, Kristen,
Yeah.
we're just using coaching associations as an example
Right.
of a leading body.
Right.
So obviously there's a lot of other ones, so we can't get into all of them, but this is an example of a leading body. What do you think their responsibility should be?
We spent a lot of time thinking about, there are so many different leadership organizations. We have a database of over 80,000 youth sport type entities in the United States alone, right? Covering from all kinds of different areas. And so it's really, really hard in our system because the titles of these groups aren't even the same. So to find a single word that captures all that doesn't really work. So however you sort of interpret that and thinking about the responsibilities of those leadership organizations, to those people who coach youth sports.
Wow, education and training is really interesting.
Yeah. And was there anything that's not there that somebody would like to give a shout out to that they think should be on that list of a responsibility of those leadership groups? Oh, you're going to make me run all the way up there. Thanks. Oh, you got me. All right.
My question's not so much, is there one missing? My question is education, training, network, and career. Should that all be one? Because that's the goal, right? I'm educated, I'm trained, now I have career advancement and upward mobility.
I think that's a great point. And that goes back to sort of what the coaching court folks were saying before, right? The idea that how do we shift this from being something that's just sort of people do it to there's a pathway here, there's a program. If you get educated, you meet people, you move forward. I think there, as Vince has been saying, some of these things are just so tied together. I don't think you can separate them out. We did here because it's artificial because we're trying to start a conversation, but you're very right.
Okay, almost out of time. Last section, data and research. Do we have the data and research to support our assumptions? Obviously, we've been leaning heavily on the National Coach Survey, which you can see how valuable it is to having this conversation. This raises some interesting sort of reflections on where we are in that sort of broader infrastructure that supports coaching in this country, right? And so the data and research question is a really, really, really important one.
Vince, can I answer this question?
Yes.
No. No, we don't even know how many youth sport coaches we have. We have no good handle on it. We do not know the turnover. I know I can talk to USA Hockey and I know the churn and burn through the USA Hockey system right there, but I don't know on a larger scale at all. We have a lot of assumptions about who's coaching and why they're doing it and what's happening. We do not have the data, which means we can't then track what's working well and how we're really making a difference with some of our programming.
Okay, so just for some
So no.
insights, okay, we know from the commission report that this was flagged as an important item. There was the call out for the lack of clear data about coaches and particularly their experience in the role. We have some other sort of referenceable items, one being the basically only half of coaches are evaluated, right, by their organizations. And I think the question of evaluation is a local data question. The question of a national registry is a national data question, so there's many different layers. I know you.
I do need to point out here, and this evaluation may be summative. So, did you have a winning season or not? As opposed to formative, and did it help them develop? And that's where we know we're missing a lot of data. We do not know. So they're saying that someone is paying attention to them and giving them feedback, but what kind of feedback and how is that helping them and where is that going? All my evaluation scientists out there, please come see me at the end. We have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and we have no idea what the nature of these evaluations are or the structure of them. Again, call out for the commission report. The idea was to study and track national coaching data, which obviously makes sense, and also to conduct surveys. So obviously this is a space that we want to continue to get into. Okay, so this is the last question, then we'll send you on your way.
So please, this is where we really want to hear from you guys. We are going to be taking this conversation to other groups and having this. And so from this particular group, please share with us an insight around youth sport coaching or coaches that you wish you had data on. Because one of the things we're trying to do is say, we don't have the funding to get this data, and we know this data is needed. We need to hear from you. What would help you to have more concrete data on? What assumptions do you need backed up by something solid? Yeah. Really, really powerful.
Why
I
people
appreciate
leave coaching. I like that one.
We'll put lunch in there, and I'll talk to you in a minute. So I don't want him to come off this slide just yet, but just so you know, the conversation is continuing. There's a North American Coach Development Summit in Columbus in June, the 10th, 11th, 12th, that brings together people who are coach educators and coach developers. We're going to be talking to them there. There are some other places that you can be thinking about this as
That
well.
will be announced when they happen.
Yeah.
But look, thank you so much for this. I know this was kind of a high-level sort of run through, but the feedback from the Slido is super helpful for us. Continue the conversation as you go through. The one thing reach out to us if you want to share your thoughts, questions,
Please share.
if you're interested. Thank you very much.